Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran, and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. And I have with me a very special guest, Dr. Edward Luttwak. Now, he needs no introduction, but just for the benefit of viewers who might not be familiar with him, Dr. Luttwak is an American political scientist. He was born in Romania, and he has authored many books on geopolitics, international relations, and military history. Now, among his works is one particular book titled Coup d'etat, a Practical Handbook. Now, he has been associated with many universities in the United Kingdom and the United States, and has also been associated with an American think tank based in Washington, D.C., called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he has also collaborated with the U.S. Ministry of Defense and co-developed what is known as the current maneuver warfare concept. Dr. Luttwak, welcome to DD India.
Thank you.
Dr. Luttwak, I said that Coup d'etat, a Practical Handbook, is one of your more popular works, but that is only the first of many more to come. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you have written more than 20 books. Am I correct?
That's correct. But I have to be very frank with you. And I have spent most of my life working on practical military problems, often in the field, often in country, conducting military operations. And I've written the books as a sort of hobby. I'm interested in history, but these are just hobbies. I'm not actually a university type person, and I've been an independent contractor.
Right.
So sometimes I write stuff, and sometimes I do stuff, but it's in the military field.
Right.
So, and I visit countries. For example, I've been to Arunachal Pradesh, right up to the end of the horrible BRO tracks.
Right.
And I've actually seen the territory. I was not where the fighting was now in Ladakh at that point, because I was there several years ago. But I'm familiar with the general Ladakh environment. Right. So, in other words, I'm a kind of practical sort of fellow.
Sure. Now, I said, Dr. Luttwak, that Coup d'etat, a Practical Handbook, was one of your many books, but one book in particular has caught attention in this part of the world, and that is titled The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, published in 2012. Now, one strand of thought which comes out of this book deals with the lack of strategic logic in China, in what China thinks and does, and you refer to only the semblance of a strategic culture. You refer to Sun Tzu, but you dismiss those treatises as quote unquote a bag of tricks. So my question to you is this, Dr. Luttwak. In your estimation, Dr. Luttwak, is there actually a lack of strategic logic in what China does?
I think that the Chinese, throughout their history, have been good at absolutely everything, from working, producing things, art, every possible human achievement. But in strategy, they have been terrible. So much so that, as you know, the last Chinese dynasty was not Chinese at all, was foreign conquerors. A handful of people entered China on horseback, conquered China, ruled it for 300 years. Before that, there was a Chinese dynasty that lasted maybe 200 years or less. Before that, it was the Mongols. Before that, it was another Manchurian conqueror. Before that, it was a Turkic conqueror. In other words, the Chinese lose. When it comes to conflict, they are no good at it. Their neighbors, the Russians, arguably are not much good at anything except strategy. So that today we have the spectacle of Russia, very much a great power, even though its economy is the size of Italy's. When is the last time that the foreign government trembled because the Italians might be threatening them? So we have two neighbors, Russia and China. One is great at strategy, and indeed they have the largest country in the world. Nobody gave it to them. And the other is China, which bungles and fails. And in my book, which was, as you say, printed in 2012, and by the research ended about 2011, essentially predicted every single thing that happened, not because I'm a great prophet, but because I could see the Chinese strategy unfolding like a very cheap toy of the kind you wind up, and it's not something electronic that goes right or left, but it's like a little mouse you wind up and then it runs across the room. I predicted that they would quarrel with all the governments around them, even though at the time the Japanese government was very soft and neutralist, really neutralist. The Indian government of Mr. Singh was so focused on economic activities that they had no eye for strategy, were very unwilling to respond to border crossings and whatever. And the politics were all wrong to predict that there would be an alliance emerging, what I call a maritime alliance. Australia was actually the first. In 2008, the Australians published a white paper saying that if the countries around China don't get together, they will all fall to Chinese power, economic, and so on. The Japanese only got on board in 2012. The Americans themselves really only got on board in the last 6 months of the Obama administration, because until then they thought that Xi Jinping was coming to Washington to settle everything, to demilitarize the South China Sea and so on.
Right.
So, really it's the last few months of Obama, and of course with Trump. And in India itself, it took until you have the Modi prime minister and Jai Shankar foreign minister, who have, he was ambassador to Beijing. He watched the whole thing. There's a whole team there. But in 2012, none of this was there, yet I could predict it because I could see that the Chinese were winding up and they were going to go straight and turn their neighbors into their enemies. Who created the maritime alliance? It was the Chinese.
Right. Another article, Dr. Luttwak, which you wrote in 2011 is titled, "Why China Will Not Become the Next Global Power, But It Could." That's the title of your article. And you make many valid points, three of which I want to cite here. And I'm quoting you here. You say, and I quote, "China has only one certain ally, Pakistan." That's number one. Number two, only the addition of the Russian Federation to the Chinese side would have true strategic significance. And number three, India may hold the key to success. Could you elaborate, Dr. Luttwak?
Well, let me say that in that article that you quote, I point out that if the Chinese stopped building a navy, so the Americans and the other countries, including India, did not worry about Chinese warships, if they actually remained with a modest military force and made no claims on the little tiny islands of Japan, or the offshore islands of the Philippines, or pieces of the Himalayan, glaciers and Himalayan territory, then what would there be on the world scene? Chinese tourism, Chinese investment, the Chinese market, and the Chinese would be welcome everywhere and influential everywhere, and no government would want to irritate them, antagonize them, turn them in, because Chinese tourism, Chinese investment, Chinese market, and that is what would make China into a power, potentially the greatest power in the
Right.
world temporarily during this phase. Because as we all know, the Chinese term is limited because demography in China is going to generate an aging population. We know all that. But this is exactly the situation of Germany in 1914. They had the world's greatest bank, the Deutsche Bank. The German universities were so superior that when Englishmen went to study at Oxford, they had to pass a German exam because all the classics were in German, chemistry, physics, math, everything was German, and the only thing you could study in Oxford without passing German exam was English literature. So they had the universities, the finance, the greatest industry. They had the electrical industry, pharmaceutical. They had everything. And what did they do, the idiots? They started building a navy to capture little islands in the Pacific. They just completely became, looking back on it, today Germany is the strongest country in Europe. They had to get there by way of a 3-generation diversion through stupid losing wars. And the same story was facing China. But when I wrote the book, I said, it's very obvious that the Chinese should not embark on expansionism if they really want to expand.
Right.
But they won't do it. They won't do it. They will act like the little mouse that you wind up keeps banging. And of course, with regard to India, China could be a very great power on the Indian scene if it was entirely peaceful. If it didn't claim 1 inch of Indian territory, and then why would the Indians reject them? Why would Indians reject Chinese products, technology, influence, and so on and so forth? But this is not how humans do things. History is a sequence of crimes and follies, and nobody ever learns anything from it.
I want to get a sense from you, Dr. Luttwak, on what is happening between India and China today as we speak, in particular relation to what is happening in Ladakh. Now, I want to quote some of your tweets, which can be broadly classified or categorized into 3 issues or areas. One has to do with Russia and India-Russia relations. There are 3 interesting tweets from you about Xi Jinping in particular. And one last tweet I want to quote has to do with India-China relations. So if I can start by quoting one of your tweets about Xi Jinping, you say, the government of India receives much advice free of charge on how to deal with China. The worst I heard is that it should stop buying weapons from Russia. Yes, Putin and Xi Jinping kiss and hug, but Russia is Vietnam's main weapons supplier and sells its best accounts to India. You decide. Now, this is on India-Russia relations. Hold your thought, Luttwak. I want to quote 3 more tweets on Xi Jinping. You say, the Chinese economy has stopped growing in many places. It is shrinking, causing increasing unemployment. In the cities, millions of migrant workers are on their own, jobless and far from any fragment of a family they might have. Xi Jinping needs to divert attention. You go on to say that successful de-escalation in Ladakh would force the Chinese to generate wolfish news with incidents in Arunachal or Sikkim unless they go back to Philippines, given that Vietnam has retaliation ready and Japan is ready and waiting for on Senkakus. Xi Jinping needs external conflict. And the third tweet on Xi Jinping, when asked why I am anti-China, not and pro-Chinese people anti-regime, visited often since 1976, was happy to see China rise from dirty misery to dignity and high culture too. But Xi Jinping militarism is encircling China with enemies. Dr. Luttwak, help our viewers understand where you're coming from in your perception of Xi Jinping.
Well, as you know, before him, there was Hu Jintao, and Hu Jintao presented himself as the first among equals of the 7 members of the Politburo.
Right.
And you could see that Hu Jintao was looking for consent of his colleagues. The Politburo as a whole was consulting the Standing Committee of 7, consulted the Politburo, and there were a horde in Beijing. There were maybe 200 or 300 people who were advisors of the Politburo. So when I would travel in China, I would go to different places, but often, of course, start in Beijing. And in Beijing, I would meet counterparts, my colleagues. And my colleagues made it clear that they were just being consulted on the speech. They were consulted on that. And now it's all gone. He's making decisions by himself. The other Politburo members are sitting like schoolchildren in front of him while he's on a high chair. He doesn't consult them. At the regional level, the party secretaries everywhere have been reduced to clerks. So it's super centralized. And therefore, a lot of what is going on really comes exclusively from his own imperatives of the moment. For example, when the incident happened in Ladakh, Indians could be excused for thinking that this is an India-China thing. But as you know very well, during that same period of a week or 2 weeks or whatever it was, there was a naval incident off the shores of Vietnam with the sinking of a fishing boat as part of an aggressive maneuver. In that same time, the Chinese government imposed sanctions, that is, threatened sanctions and imposed some sanction on the Australians, because the Australians at the WHO, World Health Organization, asked for an investigation of this malady, right? So quarrel with Australia, quarrel with Sweden. Sweden happened to be the first country in the world to have a cultural program with China. I actually was at the Swedish embassy in Beijing 40 years ago when they inaugurated that by chance. I had Swedish diplomatic friends.
And by the way, those are called Confucius Institutes.
Right. They closed not only that, they closed all the cultural relations because they discovered that they were using them improperly to penetrate the political system. And of course, Canada. There was a Canadian, unfortunate Canadian, sentenced for drug dealing to prison term. They pulled him out of prison, resentenced him to death because the Canadians, in other words, Xi Jinping was not quarreling with India. He was quarreling with anybody he could quarrel with at that point. And when somebody who runs a country like China is quarreling with 7, 8 neighbors at the same time, there must be a reason for it. And that obvious reason, perhaps is simple-minded, it's not a very clever thought, is that when you cannot manage your domestic situation, you try to distract public opinion. Everybody does that.
Talking about Chinese strategic thinking or the lack of it, Dr. Luttwak, I want you to give us, our viewers, a sense of a school of thought in India, which says, and I'm quoting from a recent interview given by a former Indian envoy to China, Gautam Bambawale. He says, for minor tactical gains on the ground, China has strategically lost India.
Well, the Chinese would argue they never had India, but it's obviously Gautam Bambawale is right in the context of what I was saying earlier, which is an unaggressive China, which approaches the world only with investment by offering markets, tourism, and so on, would be a China that would, of course, have gained India's strong friendship, cooperation, and would have done very well with India in many ways. Instead, they are acting, but what is not true is that this is a question of minor tactical gains. This is not, because the expansionist pressure in general is not a tactical thing. It has a tactical expression, in some specific place. And as we all know, one part of the story is that finally, India is providing infrastructure in those areas and quite changing the balance of power. Because when you have, for example, an airstrip like this Dalad Beg, whatever it is, you have that airstrip at extremely high altitude. Even if you have very modest roads emanating from that airstrip, the fact is that when one C-17 transport, big jet transport, lands supplies, one single flight can bring as many supplies as maybe 300 helicopter flights. Instead of 300 precarious helicopter flights, one airplane brings the supplies. And in the past, as you know, there was a real problem with Indian forces way up front, like in Taiwan and beyond Taiwan in Arunachal, which I visited. You have Indian troops with nothing behind them. It's only a zigzaggy road that an Indian army truck would take 5 days to cover to bring supplies. And imagine there is a mortar platoon, right, which is mortars, very simple weapon. They can fire a truckload of ammunition in 20 minutes. And if now they have to wait 3 weeks for a resupply truck. So in the fact that there's been some improvement in the roads, the BRO is working better, the Border Roads Organization is better. When I first saw their handiwork, what I saw were impassable tracks, useless tracks, and punctuated by the mansions of the contractors. You would go on some trackless mountain road, suddenly there'd be a mansion. That's the contractor. That's where the money went, not in the road. Things have improved generally, plus the fact that now there is a really good model. The model is to build airstrips and use them for resupply, because you can really change the tactical balance. However, as I wrote in my tweet, if the Ladakh situation is stabilized diplomatically or militarily, either way, and the Chinese don't move anymore, I bet you they're going to move in Sikkim, conceivably in that Bhutan corner, or Arunachal. Unless, of course, they get something much bigger going on with Taiwan or one of those things. But they've been blocked in different places. The Vietnamese, as you know, have completely blocked the Chinese because they've said, we are not playing games here. You recall that the Chinese put an offshore platform off the coast of Vietnam.
Right.
Whereupon the Vietnamese sent their pathetic little boats to this logic, and they couldn't. And the Chinese sent their big ships. Whereupon the Vietnamese said, this is not a game. This is not a game like chess that you put your things here. And they started attacking the Chinese within Vietnam. Message, we will cross the border into China. The adjacent area is inhabited by minorities, not by Han Chinese. We're going to go and we're going to invade your country because we don't surrender. So the Vietnamese have them stopped. And that's why occasionally they sink a boat or something because they're frustrated. The Japanese themselves are not intimidated. They made it very clear. that they regard these little Senkaku Islands, these distant rocks, the same as Tokyo. So we're not willing to negotiate because the Chinese kept saying, this is a dispute, so we must negotiate. The Japanese said, no, it's not a dispute. For us, it's like Tokyo, and there's been no negotiation. So there's been hardening. They misbehaved, and that is what I wrote back in 2012. And as I say, at the time, what you would call political scientists criticized the book, quite rightly, because they said that here you are predicting the behavior of a country like China 10 years ahead, but won't the Chinese pull back once they see that they fail? And I said, no. They don't pull back because that is what countries in motion like that, they never do. They never stop. They always go until they smash the whole thing. So it was my pessimistic interpretation.
Talking about some other issues, Dr. Luttwak, there are two key arguments which one can read and hear about in the narrative, the global narrative, and that has to do with the so-called one China policy and China's so-called one country, two systems formula. Do you think the time has come for the world at large or some countries in particular to revisit those two themes, the one China policy, vis-a-vis Tibet, for instance, or Taiwan or Hong Kong, for that matter, and to revisit the so-called one country, two systems formula all over again?
Well, you have to make a distinction. Mm-hmm. In the case of Taiwan, the United States government is bound to the protection of Taiwan by a law. There is a law called the Taiwan Relations Act. It's a law. And that law states that the United States government will protect the island of Taiwan. The United States government no longer believes that the island of Taiwan is the Republic of China, does not believe that the Taiwanese should be ruling China, which was the rather absurd position before, but that they will not allow anybody to invade Taiwan and will intervene. And of course, the Chinese Navy has been expanding a lot, but they're still 25 or 30 years away, unless, of course, new technology overturns the importance of aircraft carriers, which may well happen. But they're in no position to challenge the United States. And secondly, the Taiwanese themselves, only in the last 2 or 3 years, have begun to be serious about their own defense. Before that, they were buying, tanks for show. They wanted big ships for show. And they always asked for the latest possible jet fighter, relevant or irrelevant to their needs. Now they're beginning to get serious. And as you know, an island of 20 million people with a lot of clever people, hardworking people, with lots of money, can make itself unconquerable. You really can do it today because technology has evolved in favor of the defense, as you know. We have anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles. We have all sorts of things that many can be scaled down to portable weapons. And technology really favors the defense. So Taiwan is one story, but Hong Kong is an entirely different story. Right. In the case of Hong Kong, as you know, the British extracted some verbal commitments from the Chinese that they would respect the separate government of Hong Kong for 50 years. But the British were in no position to impose that. And the reason why the British went ahead with it was because at the time, they and most people around the world believed that as China would get richer, it would get more democratic, more liberal, and start inching towards the rule of law. And that, of course, is a huge disappointment. Because there was a great improvement from Mao to Deng Xiaoping. It was like darkness to light. And then it got better and better. And you may not like Hu Jintao, and border stuff began under him, but it was a reasonable government. No longer is. And that calculation the British made all those years ago was a gamble that China would improve to the point where it would itself safeguard Hong Kong as a very useful financial outwards. If India had Hong Kong, it would benefit enormously from it. Imagine you took Bombay or somewhere like that, you turned it into Hong Kong, operating under Hong Kong rules, which are in effect British rules. And, Indians have a relationship with the British, but the fact is that all over the world, when companies in two countries make a contract, they specify that it will be judged under British law. A Portuguese company makes a contract with a Czech company, and they say, if there's a dispute, it's British law. That is an English court, That's why lawyers are very rich in London. They get business from. So that kind of legality in Hong Kong made what Hong Kong is. Right. An engine of prosperity for the whole of southern China. And, the idea was that they wouldn't destroy it. But we didn't anticipate, nobody anticipated Xi Jinping's desire to control everything. Everything. He won't let the party secretary in Wuhan make a decision. When this epidemic started, he took charge. And the guy is not a doctor. He's not a public health aspect. He's not a virologist and not an epidemiologist. But on January 7, not January 13, as the way he took charge, and he made horrible mistakes. But instead of saying, I'm sorry, he had a little victory run saying, oh, I'm so great. So we have a problem here. We have a China problem, but we also have a Xi Jinping problem. And in Hong Kong, it's not the China problem, it's the Xi Jinping problem. He has to control.
Right. And Tibet, for instance?
Well, Tibet. I happen to be, and this is one of those things that happens in one's life, I was the first person, officially, the first Westerner to set foot in Tibet after the conquest, after the flight of the Dalai Lama, basically after the communist conquest. That was in 1976. They opened Tibet for tourism approximately 8 years later. And I was a guest of the Chinese government. It had to do with anti-tank warfare. At that time, 1976, they were facing 45 Soviet divisions aimed at Beijing. They wanted help. I was then considered a tank expert because of experiences I had. And there I was, and I asked as my price to visit China and give them this advice, which the Pentagon did want to give. My price was I wanted to visit Tibet. And hence I visited Tibet, and what I encountered, of course, was a colonial phenomenon, with the Chinese being very suddenly acting like Germans, and had all the sort of like the British Raj approximately 1860. That was their attitudes. So Tibet, as you know, the Chinese theory was that if they developed Tibet, the Tibetans would forget about their identity, or at least certainly forget about Buddhism, Dalai Lama, or anything of the kind. And they've been disappointed. Instead of young Tibetans staying away from the monasteries, there are almost 400,000 monks in Tibet, which is, huge number, really, considering the population. They have maintained their identity, they maintain the culture. All compliance with the Chinese is formal and not authentic compliance. Right. So in the conflict, anything that requires transit through Tibetan territory will be subject to disruption with a minimum of activity. So if you have a conventional war scenario, given that China cannot use its nuclear weapons, they're about as useful as marshmallows in any frontier confrontation. India has always this option of activating its friends in Tibet, making friends in Tibet, and they can do certain things, like, for example, interrupt the precarious railway, blow up bridges, and do things of that sort. That's a very simple, it's a very straightforward operation. Tibet represents a weakness for the Chinese, because when you have a vast territory whose indigenous population really hates you, it is a problem for them. And of course, the alternative, Ladakh, they reach Ladakh, as you know, also through Xinjiang, on the endless road that swings around from Urumqi and gets up there, goes past the Karakorum highway, and then arrives there. And that road, well, that is subject to the fact that Uyghurs are not enthusiastic about China. And the attempt to re-educate them has been quite disastrous, because many Uyghurs were not that interested in Islam. But by imprisoning them together, labeling them Islamic...
This proved counterproductive to the Chinese.
Right. They become much more anti-Chinese. When I first visited Xinjiang, I think maybe 20% were really very Muslim, 80% were not, and people were not particularly anti-Chinese at all. Right. But they become anti-Chinese because the Chinese won't leave them alone. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, they become much more Muslim. Because when you arrest people and you shove them together in a prison, it's the more determined, more ideological, more extreme people that set the thing. India knows something about this.
Dr. Luttwak, I want to ask you about a couple of questions that pertain to India-China relations in particular. For instance, what did you make of India was the only holdout, so to speak, on China's and Xi Jinping's flagship enterprise called Belt and Road Initiative, number one. Number two, what do you make of Prime Minister Modi's policy of giving a big push to infrastructure development in all along the line of actual control that separates India from Tibet and China? And also India's decision to elevate the Quad to the foreign ministerial level, so to be commensurate with the so-called new Indo-Pacific strategy. So what do you make of Indian government's so-called China policy, including BRI, including Quad and the Indo-Pacific, and including the infrastructure development push?
Well, on the infrastructure, after I traveled through areas like in Arunachal Pradesh, as you know, there are three axes. There's the Taiwan axis, the Siang axis, there's a third one further east. And when I realized there was roadlessness, I was actually quite angry about it. I'm not an Indian or Indian patriot, simply as a military guy, as a kind of military guy, because I thought it was the height of irresponsibility to have troops strung out on these endless roads. As you know, on the ground, if you put Taiwan flat, Brahmaputra River, Taiwan, straight, it's about 250 kilometers. The actual road, zigzag, it was like 2,500 kilometers. And I thought it was irresponsible to have troops strung out in high mountains with nothing behind them. And there was no possibility of helicopter resupply except for a company or two here or there because of the very low payload of helicopters in general, particularly at high altitude. So I thought it was this road building improvement, or roads and airstrip and roads as an alternative to the whole road. This is simply an adoption of proper military practice, responsible military practice. The previous was irresponsible. When I spoke with a corps commander maybe 10 years ago near Tezpur, and I said, you, General, are commanding a vast army of 70, 80,000 who are straying on this road. There is this place, Bombdilla, away. Maybe the most beautiful military base in the world. I've been there, lakes and everything. So I said, you have to go to Delhi. You have to go and sit outside the Prime Minister's office with ashes on your forehead, tear your clothes until they agree to put the border road organization under military control. Because when I said to him, how can you live with this roadlessness? Your men could be defeated very easily. They would run out of ammunition, and then they couldn't possibly resist. And his answer was, we are not responsible for the roads. It's the BRO. I said, you have to make yourself responsible. Nothing has changed on paper. It's the same BRO. But clearly, because I haven't been there in the last 6 months, but I've seen photographs of actual roads with paving, real roads that don't disappear with the rainstorm. So that's one change has happened. And Mr. Modi is focused on infrastructure. I mean, I'm not a pro-Modi person. I'm not an anti-Modi person. But his focus on infrastructure is very real. And in regard to either India abandons its Himalayan lands, which stretch from Ladakh all the way to the Burmese border, either abandons them or has to protect them. And you cannot protect them if you cannot access them. Hence, as you know, there's been road improvement, road building, and also jumping. Jumping is when you don't build a road, you just put an airstrip, and you have tracks off it. But because India has airplanes like the Chinese do not have, like the C-17, the Chinese have nothing of the kind, which is an airplane that can carry a great big freight load and yet land on a dirt airstrip. They have no such equipment. So this is simply a matter of being responsible, not leaving your troops to die in those conditions. And, in regard to, the broader foreign policy attitude and positioning, now I see the foreign minister is very active. The foreign minister, if you interviewed the foreign minister, I haven't talked to him in a long time, he would say to me, only the foreign minister can do foreign policy. When the same man was foreign secretary, he would say, of course, foreign minister is just a politician. He just showed up last week. He may know something about Tamil Nadu, but he has no idea about the world. And only the foreign secretary can do foreign policy. Well, there's been a consolidation here. But if I may venture a suggestion, India is not a very small country, but the foreign ministry is very small. India doesn't have enough people to staff embassies around the world in a manner commensurate to, India's importance. I mean, I don't know what the ratio of diplomats. The Swedish foreign ministry was larger than India's foreign ministry. Sweden is a wonderful country, of course. It does have 9 million people. And so there are some tools that need it. The big stuff is the infrastructure in the Himalayas, the strengthening of, obviously, the armed forces and so on, which means, if I were a patriotic Indian, I would be inclined to become a bomber pilot, to go and bomb HAL, Hindustan Aviation, because of their non-delivery of equipment, as you know. So there are many things to be done in a country like India. We all know that. However, there's a difference. The difference is that India now has allies. There's Japan as the infrastructure ally. Infrastructure is very important. Japan is the infrastructure ally. India is the largest recipient of Japanese aid. Most of it is infrastructure. Japan has diplomatic allies that are very watchful, like the Australians, who were lobbying very hard with their many followers, actually, for India's place in the Security Council. It has the ally United States, which is willing to supply very good equipment to India, which they would never supply to many other countries. Equipment that happens to be useful. And then it has other allies. In fact, even little Israel has a lot of technology which they share with India and they wouldn't share with anybody else. I was struck by the fact a few years ago that they invested $1 billion in a very special reconnaissance satellite, what the newspapers call a spy satellite. And they relied on an Indian launcher to send it up. So they did a hell of a lot of work. They spent $1 billion, and then they entrusted an Indian launcher to put it in space. So India has allies. China does not have allies, only Cambodia, because the Cambodians are squeezed by the Vietnamese. And the other ally it has is Pakistan. Since we've had Pakistan as an ally, I can tell you that having an ally like Pakistan is borderline, borderline. And if there's any jihadi trouble in Xinjiang, we know that it will not come from Australia or Paraguay. It will come from Pakistan, of course. So, we've had the dubious pleasure of that alliance. Now China has it. China has no allies.
Right.
It ought to have every possible ally, but its conduct has repelled its allies.
Right. On that note, Dr. Luttwak, thank you so much for making time to speak to our viewers on DD India. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this special broadcast. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.